very happy this week to have Stephen Davis presenting for us, and we'll hear a little bit more about Stephen and his work from Patrick in just a minute. As many of you know, that the DeFord Lecture Series has been a tradition, Department of the Geological Sciences here at UT Austin, back since the late 1940s. Long-standing tradition of having faculty, graduate students, and distinguished members of the scientific community from around the country and the world presenting their research at this seminar. It's named after Ronald Kinnison DeFord, who joined the department in 1948 and was a graduate advisor from 1949 to 1967. Professor DeFord supervised a very large number of master's and PhD students, many of them doing fieldwork in Western Texas and Northern Mexico. But one of his enduring contributions was the leadership of what was at the time called Technical Sessions. And so this session has been renamed after Ronald DeFord in recognition of his contributions to the department. In continuing this tradition, as I said, we're very happy to have this week Professor Davis speaking with us to tell us a little bit more about Stephen, what he's going to be talking about. I will hand things over to Patrick.
Yes, hello everyone. It is my pleasure as well to introduce Dr. Stephen Davis. Dr. Davis is a professor in the Department of Earth System Science at UC Irvine, where he directs the Sustainable Systems Analysis Group. And he's also a visiting professor at Tsinghua University in China. His research is aimed at understanding the complex interactions of human and natural systems in order to assess the causes and magnitude of damages and disruptions now and in the future, and to identify possible solutions. And the studies include food, water systems, ecosystem services, energy systems, human health, and trade, among others. Dr. Davis obtained his PhD in geological and environmental sciences from Stanford University. He's a fellow of the AGU, member of AAAS, and also the recipient of several awards, among which the AGU James McElwain Award, the ESA Sustainable Science Award, and the Cosarelli Prize in 2015. His services include being a contributing author on the latest IPCC AR6 report. He's a mentor of the AGU mentoring program. He is a member of the scientific steering committee of the Global Carbon Project and a chapter lead of the National Climate, National Climate Assessment Report, NCA 5, which is just gearing up, if I have that correctly, and an editor of the Environmental Research Letter. And he's also a co-founder of Near Zero, co-founder of the Climate Conservancies, and most interesting that I found is, well, not most interesting, but interestingly, a member of the State Bar of California. So he's also a trained lawyer. And with that, so today, Dr. Davis will talk to us about the global and regional drivers of land use emissions. And so the screen is yours.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Patrick and John, for those kind introductions. And it's an honor to be here, and fun to find out that I'm part of a legacy now that predates my own university by a good couple of decades. It sounds like the DeFord series. So that's pretty cool. So today I'll be talking about global and regional drivers of land use emissions. You see the title here. Really, this is some work that my group has been doing for close to a decade now. That's really just started culminating in some publications more recently. Because it took a lot of doing to get where we are, as you'll see. Before I dive in, though, I just wanted to say that I do work a lot on food systems and energy systems, and I think doing this work helped me to really understand that the land use sources of greenhouse gas emissions, which is what we'll be talking about mostly, are really a little bit behind, I would argue, in terms of how much research and understanding we have of those emissions in time and space and what's driving them. So it's something that we've been doing a pretty good job on with fossil fuel emissions for a long time, of understanding the different drivers and causes and sources, but we're a little behind the curve on the land use side. And so I think this is really important work, and hopefully you'll think so too. So first off, I guess, what do I mean by land use emissions? It's a phrase that I've picked because it encompasses really two main sources of emissions, which are often presented separately. And it's actually somewhat rare to see studies that combine a perspective that includes both of these. So the two are, you see here on the left, land use change, which is the things like deforestation that you often hear about, but they can include any change in our use of land from managed to unmanaged or vice versa, as well as just harvesting timber and then allowing it to regrow. That constitutes a change as well. And then on the right side, also agricultural activities. And these are things like the emissions that come from applying fertilizers, from enteric fermentation in ruminant animals, managing manure, burning agricultural residues. All of those things produce greenhouse gases too. And as I said, most times people are focusing on one or the other of these categories, but we wanted to incorporate both because together and added to fossil emissions, these really constitute the bulk of anthropogenic emissions. So how do we actually get at these emissions or estimate them? These land use change emissions are commonly assessed by what we call bookkeeping models. And these are models that take spatially explicit data sets of land use over time and then estimate carbon fluxes both to the atmosphere as well as into biomass or soils that are associated with the trends in changes over time. So depending on where you are and what kind of vegetation would exist there, you can know that if you've cleared a forest, there's a certain carbon density of that forest ecosystem, and you know that you're losing some of that over time to the atmosphere after a clearing event. On the agriculture side, we're talking about a different set of models and processes. And those are often estimated based on empirical relationships that we've observed over time. So actual measurements, for example, of how much nitrous oxide is produced when you apply a different amount of fertilizer to a field. And by taking individual measurements and then scaling them up over large areas, we're able to come up with an albeit uncertain estimate of those emissions. In this case, there are different tiers, is what we call them in IPCC speak, of how accurate we think these estimates are. And those vary according to the kinds of data, the quality and detail that you have available. So for the study that I'm going to talk to you about that was published this past January, we used a bookkeeping model called BLUE to estimate the land use change emissions. And this is the same one that the Global Carbon Project relies on in part to make their estimates. And we took agricultural emissions estimates from the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO. So if we aggregate all of these, what we find is that over the last 56-year period here, between 1961 and 2017, there's a trend in these land use emissions, and that's shown in this dark black line here. So that's the net. You can see that there are positive emissions above zero, which are coming from land use change and those various agricultural processes I mentioned. And there are negative emissions where we've abandoned agricultural land and allowed natural vegetation to regrow. So the black line is not at the top. It's somewhat offset by that negative emissions of the abandonment. But what you can kind of make out from this plot, the way we've stacked things, is that the largest sources of these land use emissions are clearing of land for crops, enteric fermentation of, as I mentioned, ruminant animals, as well as some of these other smaller pieces towards the top. On an average year, and we've expressed these in gigatons of CO2 equivalent, there's some discussion that I'll have later on about how do you actually combine and composite different types of greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous oxide and CO2. We've used global warming potentials with the 100-year horizon, and that's pretty much the common way to do it in the literature, although there's a hearty debate about other opportunities to assess these different gases. But in doing that, we see that the curve here shows that we're about 12 or 10 gigatons per year up until recent years, in which we've seen some growth, although it's been a bit jagged. And now we're ending up in this 2017 time period, at least, at closer to 15 billion tons of these CO2 equivalent gases being emitted in a given year. Just for comparison, that's about a quarter of all of the greenhouse gas emissions from these land use emissions plus fossil fuel emissions. So to give you some sense of scale. So this plot was not that hard to make. We could just tally up the bookkeeping results and that FAO data I mentioned. A lot of the work, though, came in actually looking at other breakdowns. So we also looked at where these things are happening across the world. So these are the same emissions over time, but instead of the processes, we're shading by the regions of the world. And you see a lot of the emissions here are in these regions of Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia. I'll have more to say about that in a minute, but those are more than half of the land use emissions that we tabulated. And where it really got fun was when we wanted to allocate these emissions to specific products. That's because, and I'm going to get into this a little bit, the accounting of these land use emissions is not exactly straightforward. There's lots of different options for how you assign an emission from a given piece of land to a product. So you can imagine, for instance, that just because you've cleared forest, some emissions might happen over a period of years, and you may be growing different things on that same piece of land during those years. So how do you allocate the emissions? And I'll say more about that in a second. Importantly, we did not assign any emissions to the animals if the crops that were grown were being fed to animals. We did that for some of our supplementary analyses, but we wanted to maintain sort of a production-based perspective here, where we were assigning the emissions to the immediate products of the land. Okay, so as you see, though, in this plot, the big contributors are cereal crops, so things like wheat and maize, as well as beef, wood, and oil crops, which oil crops include things like palm oil and soybeans. So those are really the largest share. They're about 90% of the cumulative land use emissions over this more than half a century. And if we break them down by what greenhouse gases, we're looking at three, and you can see that the CO2 is really a dominant piece, whereas agricultural emissions are mostly the contributors of the methane and nitrous oxide at the top. So this gives you some idea of these trends and what's been going on. As I said, we haven't done a great job of integrating both of these sources of emissions and tracking them over time. That was really the point of this paper. But we also wanted to consider what the drivers are. And what do we mean by drivers? Well, I'm going to introduce it's a relatively simple equation called the Pale identity. If any of you are familiar with the Kaya identity, that's what people often use to look at what's causing increases or changes in fossil fuel emissions. This is sort of an analogous breakdown. And what it shows is that land use emissions, as I've explained them, can be broken down into components of population times the agricultural production per person times the land per unit of agricultural production, which is the inverse of a crop yield, times the emissions associated with a given use of land. So obviously there's potentially different units on things like agricultural production. We could talk about tons of corn, or we could talk about calories of corn. So we have to also think about that, but this really gives us an opportunity to look at, for an increase in land use emissions, which of these terms is driving that increase up versus which is kind of preventing it from going as high. And so when we plot these factors over time, you can get a sense of this. So focusing on this left plot first, the different lines are these different pale factors with the change relative to the beginning of the time period in 1961. And so you can see that over the period of time, population was increasing a lot and would have tended to pull these land use emissions up. Similarly, in purple, this is all global, by the way, we see that the per capita production of agricultural commodities has been increasing over the time period. So we're actually making more food per person. On the downside, what's actually kind of keeping the black curve of emissions from rising as fast are things like the emissions per unit of production and the land per unit of production. So as I mentioned, this is the blue is the inverse of yields. So the more stuff we can grow on a given piece of land, the less land we have to use and the less emissions are going to be associated in turn. So the progress that we've made over this half century in yields has really kept these land use emissions from rising as fast as they might otherwise have. I should say that at the bottom here, what we're looking at is just the share of these land use emissions that's in those two buckets of land use change and agricultural emissions. And you can see over the time period, we had more land use change emissions earlier in the time period, less agricultural emissions. And these days, worldwide, we're roughly at an even share of each of those types. Now, I've put these other two plots that are looking at specific world regions on here so we can get a sense of how things differ when you move away from that global picture. So the colors all stay the same here, but what you can really notice is these bottom panels, I think, that we see in places like Southeast Asia, 3/4 or more of their land use emissions are coming from land use change. Deforestation in places like Indonesia are prominent in this number. Whereas in a region like North America, where we've done a lot of our clearing historically, but we haven't been necessarily clearing much land in recent years, we're now at virtually no emissions coming from land use change, and all of the emissions associated with land use are agricultural. So this gives you some idea of, the different drivers of these emissions in different places and what we might do to try to reduce these emissions going forward. So I'm going to throw up a couple of bar plots just to show these different factors, first by countries. So each of these, and hopefully they're not too small for you to see, show different of those Kaya terms, or pale terms as we've called them. First here in agricultural production, just straightforwardly looking at the top 10 countries in terms of their production of food calories. You see China is the top producer of calories. The bars in each of these plots refer to the latest year of our data, 2017. And these little circles that are on the bars are actually showing what was going on at the beginning of the time period in 1961. The shading of the bars gives you some idea of the level of affluence in terms of per capita GDP in the countries. So what you can kind of see here is, there are some big players in terms of production of agricultural commodities, places with plenty of land, but not necessarily uniformly developed. We have China and the US on here, but we also have India, Indonesia, and Brazil as rounding out the top 5. If we then move to the second panel and look at where these emissions are coming from, we see a little bit of differences start to emerge. For example, you'll notice that the US is not one of the top 10 emitters. This gets to that prior slide's point about North America not having much land use change emissions anymore. Some of these countries where emissions are still quite high are places like Brazil and Indonesia, where there is a considerable amount of land use change going on, deforestation. We can also look at the production per capita and so forth, but the one I guess that I would really kind of focus on are places where the land intensity of agriculture, so how much land is being used in order to get a certain amount of calories. You notice on this list, there's a completely different set of countries, many of them among the least developed countries in the world. And by the way, these dashed vertical lines are showing the global average. So you can see, for instance, that some of these places in sub-Saharan Africa, but also including places like Australia, have really high land requirements for the calories that they're producing. So that's something to be aware of. We can also look at these top 10s by the kinds of products that are being made to get a sense of, again, what's really driving emissions around the world. We know that obviously there's a lot of our calories globally are coming from cereal and oil crops, and that's borne out by this plot where you see those are by far the largest sources of calories. But when we look at the emissions, we start to see other patterns where, for example, beef is the second highest emitting product here. But if we then look back, we see that actually it's a very small amount of calories. So compared to the emissions associated with beef, the calories being produced are extremely small. Cereals are producing a lot of emissions, but they're also producing a tremendous quantity of calories. So in a way, this is the comparison that we really need to understand, is those emissions per unit of production. And that's what is being shown down here in the lower right. So a lot to take in here. There's a tremendous amount of data, but we were really trying to figure out where these emissions were coming from so that we could target opportunities in terms of both countries and products where we thought there were really big gains to be made in terms of reducing these land use emissions. Something that I like to show, though, probably my favorite figure from this paper, is this contour plot. It's a little bit complex, so I'll walk you through it. On the horizontal axis, we have the tons of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gases per million kilocalorie that's being produced. On the vertical axis, we have the calories produced per person. And so if you take the product of these two, you actually find these contours of the tons of greenhouse gases per person related to these land use emissions. And what we then look at with the plot is these colorful lines that are showing the trajectory over the time period in different world regions. And you can see quite a bit of separation. And for example, the Australia and New Zealand in Oceania are really associated with pretty high levels of emissions per capita. This is partly because of the relatively small populations. So the denominator here is pretty small, and the kinds of things that tend to be produced in places like Australia and New Zealand, which really produce a lot of lamb meat and beef in Australia. So very land intensive and emissions intensive stuff. And that's something that jumps out. But the other thing that I like to show is that this dashed line corresponds to 0.5 ton of CO2 equivalents per person. And you can see that only Europe has really gotten very close to that threshold, and no one has ever decreased their emissions beyond that. Now, a couple of things to say about this. One is Europe is a place that grows a fair amount of food in places like the Netherlands, but they also import a lot of their food because they don't have as much land available, and it's not necessarily good for growing all of the agricultural commodities that they like to eat. So this may underestimate the real per capita impact if we factored in that kind of import. But I think it also gets at the idea that even if the globe got on board and did the best that we've ever done, we would still, if you multiplied 0.5 ton of emissions times 8 billion people, have a fair amount of cumulative emissions coming from land use. And that's something that's really important as the world starts to contend with how do we stabilize the climate, how do we reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions, to know that we're going to have some serious challenges to move beyond this threshold of something like 0.5 ton. I'm sure there is additional progress that we can make, but there are also sources of greenhouse gas emissions from our food system, like nitrous oxide that I mentioned, that we really don't know how to completely eliminate. And I think that's going to be something that we're going to hear more about in the coming years. So as kind of a wrap up, we have this table in our paper that shows for different products how much of the different quantities of greenhouse gases we think are associated with those products in recent years. What's the total, and what's the fraction both of the land use emissions and, to me, the most interesting, of all anthropogenic emissions. And you hear a lot of discussion about different opportunities to reduce emissions. And I think the first point is to make the one that I said earlier, that about 1/4 of all of our anthropogenic emissions are related to land use and these products. Things like beef, which you hear an awful lot about, and I'm sure it's a touchy subject to some folks there in Texas, represents about 5%, we think, of all anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions in recent years. That's a sizable amount, particularly when you consider it represents much less than 1% of all the calories that people consume in a given year. In comparison, though, and I think this is worth differentiating, at the risk of provoking vegetarians in the crowd, there are meats that are being produced that represent a very small share of the total anthropogenic emissions. Chicken, for example, is about 0.1% of all anthropogenic emissions in recent years. So it may be worth differentiating a little bit and making the progress where it's the most benefit. Things like spices, it's interesting, spices actually contribute almost an order of magnitude more greenhouse gas emissions than chicken globally, but you don't hear anyone fighting battles against cinnamon and cardamom. Okay, so I promised that I'd get into some of the accounting intricacies of all of this. And I mentioned that we were using the 100-year global warming potential to tabulate the effects of methane and nitrous oxide. First off, just to think about accounting in very general terms, there are physical realities that we study as scientists, and then there are accounting systems that we put in place to actually tabulate how much emissions, for example, are contributing to climate change, or how responsible is one party versus another. And I think it's really important to know that these accounting conventions are human inventions. They're not laws of nature. They're ones that we adopt because we think they make sense and they're useful in trying to exert an influence on, say, an environmental problem like climate change. So here I've got something very schematic to help understand some of the problems of accounting for land use emissions. First, here at the very top is just a hypothetical clearing of some unmanaged land. So imagine a forest gets cleared and we start growing a crop on it. Each year that that crop is grown, there's going to be some agricultural emissions associated with it, say for fertilizer. And that will stop when and if that agricultural activity ends and then the land is abandoned back to nature. If this is a clearing event, though, the emissions from the land use change will actually naturally happen over a period of years, with the largest pulse of emissions early after the clearing, but some emissions persisting perhaps for decades after the clearing, as, for example, carbon in the soil is more slowly oxidized over time. And similarly, after an abandonment, we might expect a pretty quick pulse of carbon taken up from the atmosphere and sequestered in the soil and in emerging vegetation early after the abandonment, but eventually that will taper off too. The reason I explain all this is that this is some of the complexity, as I mentioned. If you want to allocate these emissions to a specific product that's grown in year 10 after a clearing, you need to know what these kinds of curves look like for the different regions. But it's not necessarily the case that we always want to assign the emissions according to when they occurred. So, for example, there is this concept of committed emissions where we might actually take the integral of these curves and assign all of that to the crop that's grown in year 1. Now, this would place a lot of a burden on that crop that's being grown in the first year. It would get kind of the whole penalty, if you will, of those emissions. So we might choose to do that as a way of discouraging this kind of clearing for a specific product, but it would be a choice that we would make. There are other alternatives for how to allocate that. One would be to, again, take the integral and then distribute it more uniformly. The reason here would be, if the first clearing really would not happen but for some valuable use 10 years down the road, then if we allocate according to when these emissions are actually happening, we're not necessarily putting the full and fair weight of the burden on that 10-year later product. distributing it more uniformly in time is an option that would weight those later uses or penalize those later uses more. And similarly, we could come up with other equations like a more of a discount rate that could apply that doesn't necessarily correspond to the severity of the actual emissions. But the point of this is there are different ways to allocate these emissions over time, and there are human decisions that need to go into this. Another thing that comes up is how to figure out whether a given product has contributed to a land use change. You hear a lot about this if you follow it as indirect land use change in the literature. But what we see here is, for example, in these parcels, they begin as forest, maize takes over, year 3, soybeans take over, year 4, soybeans take over another share, but at no point are the soybeans taking over from forest. So this would technically come under the Amazonian soy moratorium. They would say that was fine, but what we see is that maize has been static over these 3 years, whereas soybeans have increased. So you get into these complexities of, do you count this as maize doing the deforestation, or should we be looking at the delta and worrying about the soybeans? Anyhow, I think I've given you the flavor. I'm going to buzz through this in the interest of time, just to say in the paper, we look at all of these different temporal and product accountings and try to grapple with the implications of doing it different ways. We also, as I mentioned, do consider in some cases, what if we're feeding a crop to an animal? What does that do to the animals or the livestock sector's emissions? And you can see that the circles here are the ones where we've counted the crop emissions in the livestock sector if it's fed to a livestock. And so you can see it increases. Other emissions metrics, again, I don't want to get into the weeds. Some of you may know that there's an emerging literature on something called Global Warming Potential Star, GWP Star. This is really looking at what happens if you account for only the changes in a short-lived climate pollutant like methane. So if you had steady methane emissions year to year, this GWP Star would sort of suggest a very low contribution from methane. And you can see that in this plot here where methane emissions have kind of leveled off in terms of their 100-year global warming potential. But if you calculate it differently, you see that go way down. So I'm going to skip through just to say there are different bookkeeping models, and we dealt with a lot of these uncertainties, as well as different groups that are trying to tabulate those agricultural emissions. But I want to get on to a more interesting topic, I think. Finally, I guess before I leave this topic, we have put all this data up in a website that you can explore and plot and look at the implications of different products and regions. And I invite you to visit this website and check it out if you're interested. Okay, so I sort of teased when I was talking about Europe, this topic of international trade and what that does to things. You know, if we imagine the world's supplies of products coming from production in one place and consumption in another, often, we know this with our supply chain issues going on right now, there is this intermediate step of international trade. And so a lot of my early work was looking at how much of the fossil emissions from, say, China, where a lot of our products were being made, were actually related to consumption of those products in other countries like the US. And we do this with a technique called input-output modeling. Just to walk you through a really simple example, if we have a matrix where we know how much of a column sector is requiring inputs from a row sector, we have a matrix that describes these interactions of all the sectors in an economy. And we have some vector of final demand and total production. So if we have all of these, which we can observe from economic data, we can build what we call an input-output model that allows us to, with some nifty matrix math, to specify a given amount of final demand that we're interested in and see where in the world production has to occur in order to meet that demand. And it gets more interesting when those things aren't just the examples that I had on the prior slide, but things like American cars Chinese steel, Russian plastics, and where we actually have some interest in how much of what we're consuming is related to activities in other sectors and parts of the world. And we depend on a global data set produced by Purdue University called the Global Trade Analysis Project to give us these interactive terms of all the different sectors in the global economy. And this data set includes 141 different regions and 65 sectors. So if we're doing this, not only do we know how much necessarily of a product is happening or is being produced in another region, if we also know how much emissions are associated with that sector in that other place, we can estimate the total emissions related to a given final demand in a region. So with this kind of approach, we've now gone through and looked at how much of the food that we're consuming in different places around the world is related to these land use emissions happening in other regions. So just to show first what the fossil fuel picture looks like, this is from a 2010 paper that I wrote, where we looked at how much, again, of those Chinese fossil fuel emissions were related to products being consumed elsewhere in the world. And the colors here show who is the net importers in red and who are the net exporters of these fossil emissions in blue. And you can see pretty clearly that China is the manufacturer and exporter of the world at this point. And they're sending a lot of stuff to the US, Europe, and Japan in this picture. So now we've done this work on the land use emissions, and we find something similar and something different. The similar thing is the red countries are pretty much the same ones that we saw in that fossil picture. The net importers of land use emissions are still these affluent regions of the world. The difference is that China is not the biggest net exporter. Instead, when it comes to land use, we see the areas that light up are Indonesia and Brazil, and to a lesser extent, places like Australia. Now, this is for 2004. It's also worth noting here, this percentage, 27%, means more than a quarter of the land use emissions that I've been talking about this whole time were related to traded goods in this year. And we followed this through time. So we actually have 5 time slices that we've looked at, the most recent being 2017. And there's some interesting differences. So whereas that first map I showed you had a huge flux of emissions embodied in products that were produced in Brazil and then sent to a place like Europe, over time, we see that flux waning, and instead this larger growing flux, again from Brazil, but now going to China. And that's only grown in our most recent time slice. So these are important factors because the globe wants to understand how we can affect things like deforestation happening in places like Brazil. And increasingly, it seems like the way that we can do this is by being a little more careful about what kinds of things we're importing and trying to grapple with how those things were produced. So this is just showing the value and land and emissions that are embodied in these food products over time that are being traded internationally. And it's consistently around a quarter in each case of the global food system embodied in trade, whether you think of it by dollars or by area of land or by the emissions. So this is not to say that trade is necessarily a bad thing. There's lots of reasons we might actually like trade because, for example, if you import food that's very water intensive from a place that has lots of precipitation, that could be regarded as a resilient aspect of the global economy. The problem comes where you're importing food that's from a place where has a lot higher greenhouse gas emissions to produce that food than if you were just to make it domestically. And we can kind of see that on this plot where if we look at the ratio of emissions embodied in imports here in red versus exports in blue, a lot of these more affluent regions and larger economies are importing stuff that involves a lot more greenhouse gas emissions than what they're producing domestically. So you can kind of make this very simple analysis and look at What happens if we instead grew some of that stuff in other places? And a back of envelope suggests that we could actually make a big dent in global land use emissions by shifting where things are being grown. So this is a final plot of this paper and looking at who's doing the largest net importing up here: China, the US, Japan, and Germany, and who's doing the largest net exporting. Again, familiar countries like Indonesia, Argentina, and Brazil. And the colors are telling us something about what is actually being traded. This sort of dark turquoise color is soybeans. So you see a lot of those are getting imported by China and exported by Brazil and Argentina. And that's a lot of what's underpinning the deforestation in those regions. All right, well, I have a few extra minutes, and Professor Prasad had asked if I would shift gears and talk a little bit about something that we've been doing since the beginning of the pandemic, not related to land use emissions. So hopefully I'll have enough time to walk you through this very quickly. As we all know, for a long time, the global community has been monitoring CO2 emissions from fossil fuels. And at the end of every year, you get a big announcement by the Global Carbon Project of what that year's emissions were, how much they had increased or decreased. And that was where we were at the end of 2019 with this kind of plot. But of course, when the pandemic struck and lockdowns began, first in China and very soon after in places like LA and there in Austin, all of us began asking, what's this going to do to CO2 emissions? And no one really wanted to wait a year to find out. So we actually had to kind of on the fly build up a new system to make these estimates in closer to real time. So, how exactly was the pandemic affecting us? It's not probably that novel to a lot of you that, some of the economic activity, certainly mobility and human health, were all directly affected by the pandemic itself and the public health measures that we took in response. And in turn, that affected all kinds of things, as you see in this plot. So the first estimates of this used what's called a confinement-based approach. Essentially, they took last year's, in 2019, emissions, and then they looked at what fraction of those activities were being disrupted during the lockdowns and public health responses, and made an estimate for what that was going to mean for emissions. And this was a very clever approach, and they came up with this kind of shocking plot of how steep the drop of daily fossil emissions might be. And this came out kind of in the midst of the real lockdown period back in the spring of 2020. And that was about a 17% decrease in just those daily emissions. In the meantime, some of us were working on a less clever approach, arguably, but more data intensive one, which was to gather up near real-time activity data on all of the things that humans do that produce greenhouse gas emissions, or fossil fuel emissions, I should say. So we actually started scouring the internet and our networks of colleagues and contacts to figure out what data we could come by that would tell us in closer to near real time how many flights were there, how many ships were on the ocean, how much gas was being consumed in different places, what kind of electricity was being consumed, what was traffic doing in different places. And by stitching all of these together, and I do mean stitching because there wasn't one consistent data source that applied everywhere, we were able to introduce these near real-time estimates of global CO2 emissions for major countries and all the major sectors. And this came to be called the carbon monitor. And we've written some papers about this, but it's pretty interesting to me to see patterns of daily CO2 emissions from fossil fuels throughout the year. And you see kind of seasonal differences, for example, with the emissions tending to be lower in the summertime globally than in the wintertime when people are using more heating, for example. But you can also see crazy things like, the Christmas holiday here in the US and the Spring Festival in China. And we could look at what was happening in 2020 versus 2019 to get at what was happening due to the pandemic. So We also looked at this for sectors, and of course, people kept using electricity even though they were at home, and people kept buying stuff on Amazon. So industry kind of kept turning along. It was really the transportation sectors here that you noticed the largest changes. So cars, but especially aviation in blue and purple. And so we've got all these estimates now on a website, and I think they're current through the end of October right now. You can look at all the different countries in the world and play with different sectors and different time periods if you're interested. We also have gone the next step and now produce similar estimates for each state. So for those of you who want to see how Texas fared during this, you can log on to the US version of the website and look at this. Some interesting things happened in the US that we actually saw some rebounding of coal in the latter part of the year. This plot here is showing over the course of 2019 in gray and 2020 in red, what fraction of our electricity was coming from coal here. And you see it was sort of lower in the beginning of the year, but with natural gas prices increasing during the year, we saw actual coal kind of made a comeback toward the end of the year. Interesting things in the transport sector in the US as well that just highlighting down here. The blue is what's going on every month in gasoline consumption. The circles are 2019, the bars are 2020. So we see this big dip in gasoline consumption during the lockdown, but diesel in yellow kind of kept a pace. And again, I think this is really the fact that a lot of the trucking that uses diesel was continuing. And so that actually led to an increase in 2020's emissions intensity of transport. So because we had more diesel, which tends to be less efficient because of the heavy trucks that are using it. Another thing people always ask about is what happened when the businesses closed down. We should have been using less electricity in offices and so forth, stores, but we probably used more in households. And that was actually true, although we're actually able to say that although the businesses decreased about 6%, the residences only increased about 3%. So the net was actually beneficial. We used less electricity during the pandemic. And so we also did some fun calculations comparing these differences as between the states that had less stringent responses to the pandemic and more stringent responses. And the takeaway here is really just that the states that had less stringent responses to the pandemic had more or less the same change in emissions, less change in emissions, although more or less the same response in their GDP. So they didn't necessarily win economically, but they did sort of lose out on the emissions side. So next steps for this work, and then I'll shut up and take some questions. We're starting to incorporate near real-time data sources from remotely sensed data. And just to give you a flavor, this is a steel plant in France, and these blue boxes are blast furnaces. And you can see here thermal imagery that during the pandemic, prior to the pandemic here in February, both of these blue boxes were hot, red. But in April, you can see that one had been idled here. So we're able to use this kind of data, knowing where these facilities are. We're looking at power plants as well as steel and cement all around the world to get much more real-time estimates of the industry side, which was kind of a shortcoming of the original Carbon Monitor, where we only really had monthly data on a lot of the industry sector. So this is sort of the frontier. And I think the idea here is that we have been looking in the rear view, so to speak, by waiting a year or more to figure out what emissions have been. And as we become more and more ambitious about reducing our emissions, we really need to get these tools in place so that we can look out the windshield and be a little more agile in steering. I guess final slide, sorry, I lied about it. Just showing what's happened in 2021. This is the latest data with some projection for the last couple of months, showing that we've more or less reached pre-pandemic levels again globally. And that's something that's a little bit belied by the fact that the regional differences are pretty profound. So whereas we saw huge decreases between 2019 here and 2020 in emissions in, say, the rest of world in brown, the rebound has been largely in places like China, the US, and India. And you see over here on the right that the rest of world regions have not really rebounded very much at all. So there are these kind of profound inequities in how this rebound is playing out. Okay, thanks everyone, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you very much. That was a really exciting or illuminating presentation.
Even though you can't hear it, I want you to imagine the applause that is coming through the ether.
Oh, it's hurting my ears. It's
a very